It's no secret that Christianity is built on the foundation of the life, death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. But what if someone were to approach you with the argument that such teachings are not unique to Christianity? What if they presented you with the story of Odin and the runes, wherein the Norse Allfather, Odin, becomes a man, dies on a tree, and then rises from the dead? Does this mean that ancient religions really are full of examples of gods who become men, who die and then rise from the dead? In order to answer this question, we're going to have to dive into the myth of Odin and the runes and compare what this story teaches to what we find in the Gospels regarding Jesus Christ. Now, our primary source for Odin and the runes is in the Poetic Edda, also known as the Elder Edda or Sæmund's Edda. This is a collection of epic poems that were compiled by an anonymous author sometime in the 13th century. So that is roughly 1200 years after the birth of Christianity, and about 429 years after the first Viking contact with Christendom at Lindisfarne, England in 793 AD. More than that, the Viking kingdoms in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden converted to Christianity starting in the 11th and 12th centuries. So there is about a 100 to 200 year gap between the Christianization of the Vikings and when the myths in the Poetic Edda were finally written down. So if one claims that the core beliefs of Christianity were somehow corrupted beyond recognition in the 60 to 90 year span between the life of Christ and our oldest surviving gospel manuscript, then who's to say that the legend of Odin and the runes accurately represents a pre-Christian myth when the oldest surviving example of this myth is found in a document that postdates the Christianization of the Vikings by at least a century? This is a two-way street. One can't argue that the Christians were the only ones who borrowed from other religions, when we in fact have good evidence that ancient pagans often incorporated Christian themes into their religious practices. One really good example of this is the festival of Yule. According to Snorri Sturluson, in his History of the Kings of Norway, Yule was moved to December 25th by King Haakon the Good in the 10th century. And King Haakon did this specifically so that Yule would coincide with Christmas. Prior to this, we have records from an ancient chronicler known as Theitmar of Merseburg, who wrote that the Vikings would meet every 9th year in January to, quote, offer to their gods 99 people and just as many horses, dogs, and hens, or hawks, for these should serve them in the kingdom of the dead and atone for their evil deeds, end quote. So all that to say, what do we actually find in the myth of Odin and the runes? Was it another case of Christians stealing from paganism, or is it pagans stealing from Christianity? So in order to answer that, we need to look into the actual myth, and this is what we find when we read Odin and the runes. So it begins, I hung on a windy tree 9 whole days and nights, stabbed with a spear, offered to Odin, myself to my own self given, high on that tree of which none hath heard from what roots it rises to heaven. None refreshed me, even with food or drink. I peered right down in the deep. Crying aloud, I lifted the runes, then back I fell from thence. 9 mighty songs I learned from the great son of Balethorn, Bestla's sire. I drank a measure of wondrous mead. With the soul stirrer's drops I was showered. Ere long I bare fruit and throve full well. I grew and waxed in wisdom. Word following word, I found me words. Deed following deed, I wrought deeds. Hidden runes shall I seek, and interpreted signs, many symbols of might and power, by the great singer painted, by the high powers fashioned, graved by the utterer of the gods. For gods graved Odin, for elves graved Dane, Valin, and Dalar for the dwarves, all wise Jotuns, and I, of myself, graved some for the sons of men. Dost know how to write? dost know how to read, dost know how to paint, dost know how to prove, dost know how to ask, dost know how to offer, dost know how to send, dost know how to spend. Better ask for too little than for too much, like the gift should be the boon. Better not to send than to overspend. Thus Odin graved ere the world began, then he rose from the deep and came again. So that is the myth of Odin in the runes. And before I look into this story, there are a few key details that we need to understand regarding Odin and Jesus. And first of all, they are fundamentally different beings regarding their origins. While Odin is one of the gods credited with the creation of the world, in Norse mythology, the world was created from the body of a giant that Odin and his brothers slew. Both Odin and his two brothers were not eternal beings. They were born out of a union between the god Bor and the giantess Bestla, who we actually was mentioned earlier in that myth. Now, however, unlike the gods of Norse mythology who emerged from an eternal universe, the Bible states that Jesus existed before the universe began. And we see this in Genesis 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was formless and empty, and darkness covered the surface of the watery depths. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light." And John, in the opening lines of his Gospels, parallels these themes, saying, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. All things were created through him. And apart from him, not one thing was created that has been created. In him was life, and that life was the light of men. That light shines in the darkness, and yet the darkness did not overcome it." And John goes on to later say, "The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth." And there is, of course, no better example of Christ's eternal nature than that found in Colossians 1:15 through 20, which reads, "He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For everything was created by him in heaven and on earth, the visible and the invisible. Whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and by him all things hold together. He is also the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that he might come to have first place in everything. For God was pleased to have all of his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile everyone to himself, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his shed blood on the cross." So we can see that there are fundamental differences between the way that Christians understood Christ and the nature of Odin and the Norse pantheon. They are quite different, ontologically speaking. Now that that's out of the way, let's take a look at the myth of Odin in the runes and see what, if any, similarities we find between the myth and the Gospels. So first of all, Odin's motivation was to gain wisdom for himself. He had already sacrificed an eye previously in another story to gain wisdom. And the reason why he was hanging from the tree in the story is to stare into a mythical well to unlock the mystery of runic writing. Now, Jesus, however, was motivated by love for us. God, according to Christianity, is not simply loving or merciful. He is love and mercy. He's not like a pagan god who is a god of love or a god of mercy. He actually is the personification of these things. But he is also holy and just, and our sins are a crime against him, his holiness and goodness, and against others. And since God is justice, he requires that all crimes must be punished. But God is also mercy and merciful. So as Jesus, God came to us, lived a sinless life as one of us, and died a criminal's death in our place, thus taking the penalty that our crimes deserved upon himself. And then by rising from the dead, God offers us his forgiveness, love, and mercy through Jesus. So it works around his justice and allows him to be merciful to people who don't deserve it. Now, again, Jesus clearly became a man according to, Jesus was God in human form according to the Bible. But Odin, if you noticed in the myth, did not become a man. He was a god the entire time. And more than that, the tree that Odin was hanging from in the myth is Yggdrasil. This is the mythical world tree. He doesn't come to Earth in the story. He's on a interdimensional tree between the 9 realms, hanging there, staring down into a well that the tree is growing out of. Jesus, on the other hand, dies on a literal cross. The Gospels aren't being mythical here. They are sober accounts of actual historical events. Everything in the Gospels regarding Jesus' trial, his death, and burial are consistent with what we find regarding first century Judea in extra-biblical sources and also in archaeology. In the myth of Odin and the runes, Odin doesn't die. He hangs on the tree, but he doesn't die. Jesus was quite dead, and we'll get into that more as we go along here. Odin hung on Yggdrasil on the verge of death for 9 days and 9 nights. Jesus was dead and buried for 3 days, and this is according to Jewish reckoning of time. The ancient Jews weren't like us. They didn't measure time as a 24-hour span from midnight to midnight. They understood a day beginning at sundown and going from sundown to sundown. Thus, Jesus' arrest, trials, execution, and burial all happened on Friday before sundown. So he was buried on the same day that he died. He was buried all day Saturday, and then he rose from the dead on Sunday morning, and Sunday technically began at sundown Saturday night. Another weird thing with the ancient Near Eastern culture that the Jews were in is that they counted anything that happened within that period of sundown to sundown as being a full day. Thus, Jesus was buried for 3 days and 3 nights, according to how they understood time, and in that culture, that was perfectly acceptable. But back to Odin. Since he didn't die on the tree, he didn't resurrect either. He just returned to the realm of the gods. Jesus physically rose from the dead, according to Christianity, in a real body. He wasn't a ghost or a spirit. He didn't just ascend back up into the heavens. And this is actually kind of an interesting point, because while the Jews did believe in a bodily resurrection at the end of time, belief in a physical resurrection from the dead was not common in the ancient world. This is unique to the Jewish culture, but even they didn't believe that someone would rise from the dead prior to the resurrection at the end of time. That means that if Jesus' disciples were trying to invent a story, they could have used a plethora of other examples that were present in the culture to explain what they saw. It would have been more acceptable for them to say that Jesus' spirit visited them, or that an angel came to them, as we see something similar happen in Acts chapter 12 when Peter escapes from prison and his friends think that he's dead, and that him knocking at the door is actually his angel. So we have a cultural context where that sort of thing would have been acceptable. But the Gospels record that Jesus was seen visibly, that the tomb was discovered empty, and that he ate with his followers. And it was the physical interaction with Jesus combined with the fact that they found the tomb empty that convinced the disciples that he had been raised from the dead, which again was unique and not really expected even in the culture that believed in the resurrection of the dead. So that being said, the only similarities between the story of Odin and the runes and the Gospels is this idea of a god offering himself as a sacrifice, and the fact that both Odin and Jesus are pierced by a spear. However, here again the stories are more dissimilar than common. First, as previously mentioned, Odin didn't die as a sacrifice, so he remains alive. The depiction, however, of Odin's sacrifice does trace back to human sacrificial practices we find in Norse and Germanic cultures, whereby the victim, who was usually a noble, would be hung from a tree and then speared as an offering to Odin or Woden, depending on when and where this was taking place. And this makes sense given Odin's statement in the story that he was an offering given to himself. An offering of himself given to himself. That phrase is found in a number of other, number of other areas in the Eddas. So it's not unique to this story. Jesus, however, his sacrifice is deeply connected to animal sacrifices in the Jewish culture and is more symbolic. The accounts we find in the scriptures regarding his crucifixion are historically accurate, and they're depicting crucifixion. But crucifixion wasn't a form of human sacrifice, and human sacrifice was actually condemned in the Old Testament scriptures. So they're not trying to paint a picture of human sacrifice by what they record in the Gospels, unlike the story of Odin and the runes, which is clearly inspired by pagan practices. Instead, they're reporting what they saw happen, and the similarity between Jesus' sacrifice of himself on the cross is more symbolic, and it draws parallels to the animal sacrifices in the Jewish religion, and in particular the slaughter of the Passover lamb, since this was happening during the Passover celebration. So this means that when we find Jesus being pierced by a spear in the Gospels, this again is a mark of historicity, because the Romans had this practice of a death blow, and that would involve either spearing the person or bashing in their head with a mallet to make sure that they were dead. So again, this isn't a parallel so much as it is a historical mark. This is depicting what actually happened. Jesus' death doesn't have any parallels with human sacrifice. Odin's death, haning and spearing on this in this myth is consistent with human sacrificial practices. Although, as I said before, Odin doesn't die. He doesn't actually die from having his spear run through his own chest. So, in light of the evidence, it would seem that the alleged similarities between the myth of Odin and the runes in the Gospels come more as a result of individuals interpreting Norse mythology through a cultural lens that has been shaped and defined by Christianity. They are essentially reading Christian themes into this myth where such themes are not present. That said, while it is not impossible for the myth of Odin and the runes to have borrowed certain elements and phrases from Christianity, I personally don't think this is a viable argument. Instead, I feel like the myth of Odin and the runes appears to be inspired, at least in part, by pre-Christian practices, as in the human sacrificial aspect of it. What is more, rather than exposing an underlying commonality between Christianity and Norse mythology, the central themes behind the myth of Odin and the runes and the Gospels show that these are fundamentally different accounts. The Gospels are presented in a sober, historically accurate way. They seem to report actual events that happened with what we know from archaeology and history. And whereas the myth of Odin and the runes, it doesn't make any such claim. It doesn't pretend to be describing something real, and it is full of mythological elements. The tree is not a real tree. Odin doesn't become a man. He remains a god the entire time. And he's hanging himself from a tree, from this mythological world tree between realms to gain knowledge. So I would say that Odin and the runes, or the claim that Odin and the runes represents a pre-Christian tradition wherein a god becomes a man, dies on a tree, and rises from the dead, is itself a myth. We just don't have any evidence of that in the myth itself. And when you really look into the sources that detail this, nobody makes that claim. So this is not a historically accurate or founded claim. So anyway, those are my thoughts on the myth of Odin and the runes. As I hinted at kind of in the beginning of this, I do have some other works that I've done regarding some other myths, and I have those on my blog. I'll be sharing a link for those down below. If there is interest in this topic, I may be persuaded to do some more videos addressing some of these. Probably more so with parallels that I'm not familiar with, that I haven't already addressed. If you'd like to see some videos of that nature, leave a comment down below and I'll address those. And if there's enough interest, I'll probably end up making a video. If you want to check out the blog, I'll have a link there. I'll have links for some sources where you can look into these myths for yourself. And as always, keep seeking truth.